Some nights start like any other but end up haunting us in ways we never imagined. Mine began just like that, ordinary, until it wasn't. I can still hear the echo of my high heels against the empty building's floor. It was late, I was exhausted, but relieved to finally put an endless day behind me. The rain outside beat against the windows, creating a soothing sound that almost made me forget the loneliness of yet another long night. I had stayed later than usual, the last one to leave the office, and the strange silence in the hallway seemed to amplify my presence. I pressed the elevator button and waited. When the door slid open, I took a deep breath and stepped inside, ready to leave it all behind. As the doors began to close, I heard hurried footsteps. Before I could react, a hand shot between them, stopping the closure. A man stepped in, a polite smile playing on his lips. He was impeccably dressed, his dark suit perfectly tailored to his tall, athletic frame. I didn't recognize him immediately, but he seemed so at ease that for a moment I wondered if I should know him. "Sorry for the sudden entrance," he said, his voice low and husky, a timbre that seemed to resonate within me. "Almost didn't make it." I simply smiled, a quick mechanical gesture, and moved to the opposite corner. His presence was overwhelming, as if he occupied far more space than he physically should. He didn't just seem to be there, he seemed to command the environment, even in silence. I pressed the button for the ground floor, trying to focus on anything else, but it wasn't easy. His cologne, a mix of wood and spice, filled the elevator, and my mind wandered to places it shouldn't. The soft sound of rain and the hum of dim lights made the moment feel even more intimate. Even without words, the atmosphere was heavy. Then it happened, a jolt. The lights flickered, and the elevator stopped with a harsh, unpleasant sound. For a moment, we both stayed silent, processing what had just occurred. I moved toward the control panel, pressing buttons with a certain urgency, but nothing happened. "Looks like we're stuck," he remarked, crossing his arms and leaning casually against the wall. He seemed so calm, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. "Great," I muttered, more to myself than to him. I ran a hand through my hair, already feeling the tension building inside me. Being trapped in an elevator with a stranger wasn't on my agenda for the night. He shifted slightly, adjusting his tie while watching my increasingly frustrated attempts at pressing more buttons. "It's no use," he said, tilting his head. "I think we'll have to wait." There was something in his tone, a relaxed confidence that irritated and intrigued me at the same time. I felt tempted to retort, but I realized my irritation was just a mask for what I was really feeling. His presence was unsettling. Every movement, no matter how small, seemed designed to capture my attention. I leaned back against the opposite wall, trying to keep a safe distance, but the space was small, and proximity was inevitable. He was tall, his broad shoulders almost brushing the elevator walls. The dim lighting highlighted the strong line of his jaw, and I had to look away to keep from staring too long. "Are you okay?" he asked after a moment, breaking the silence. "I'm fine," I lied. My heart was pounding faster than I cared to admit, and the rising heat in the confined space didn't help. I ran my hands over my thighs, trying to distract myself, but every movement seemed to draw more of his attention. He watched, his dark eyes following my every gesture as if he were reading my thoughts. "You seem tense," he said, leaning slightly toward me. His voice carried a suggestive tone, though the words themselves were neutral. "Of course I'm tense," I snapped, trying to mask my nervousness with a sharp tone. "We're stuck in an elevator." He smiled, a smile that left me unnerved. "Fair point." The silence returned. But it was a heavy, dense silence. I could feel his gaze on me, the weight of our proximity. I tried to focus on something else, the rain outside, the useless control panel, but nothing worked. The only thing I could think about was him. Time seemed to have stopped, just like the elevator. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was full of things I couldn't put into words. The cramped space made it impossible to ignore his presence, and that only made things worse. I could feel his gaze on me, even when I couldn't muster the courage to look back. "Why don't you sit down and relax?" he suggested, nodding toward the floor. There was something in his voice, that calm, confident tone, that made my body react in ways I didn't want to admit. "Relax," I laughed, though the sound came out more nervous than amused. "We're stuck in an elevator. Not exactly the most relaxing scenario." "Depends on how you see it," he replied, his lips curving into a subtle smile. "Maybe it's the perfect chance to slow down." Easy for him to say. He stood there, casually leaning against the wall, as if he didn't have a single care in the world. Meanwhile, my heart was pounding like it wanted to escape my chest. Finally, I let myself slide down the wall to the floor, crossing my legs and adjusting my dress. The position left me feeling more vulnerable, and I realized it too late. His gaze dropped quickly, and the way his eyes lingered on me made my face burn. "Better?" he asked, lowering himself until we were at the same level. We were just inches apart now. The closeness made the air feel thicker, almost hard to breathe. "It's what we've got, isn't it?" I muttered, looking away toward the useless elevator panel, trying to ignore the woody scent that seemed to surround me. For a moment I thought the silence would return, but then he leaned in slightly, until the distance between us was nearly non-existent. "You seem uncomfortable," he said, his voice so low it sounded like a secret. "What's bothering you?" I looked at him, finally finding the courage to meet those dark eyes that seemed to see everything I wasn't saying. "I think you already know," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He tilted his head, a slow, provocative smile curling his lips. "I have an idea." Before I could say anything, I felt the tips of his fingers brush against the side of my arm. It was a light, almost casual touch, but the impact was like an electric shock. The contact made my breath hitch and heat spread through my body like wildfire. "This is crazy," I murmured, though even I didn't believe my own words. "Maybe," he said, his fingers tracing a delicate line down to my wrist, where my pulse was fast and uneven. "But you don't seem like you want me to stop." There was a moment, a fraction of a second, where I could have pulled away, where I could have said something to put an end to this. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, letting the tension envelop me, letting the heat of his body consume me. He moved closer, his hand sliding down the curve of my waist. The dress hitched slightly as he held it, his fingers firm against my skin. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, a soft sigh escaping my lips as I felt every inch of him far too close. "You're trembling," he said, his lips hovering near my ear, so close I could feel his warm breath against my skin. "And you're too close," I replied, though my voice carried no conviction. "Do you want me to move away?" he asked, but his eyes told me he already knew the answer. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All logic seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something primal and impossible to control. When he gripped my waist more firmly and his lips brushed lightly along the curve of my neck, I felt my body completely give in. "This shouldn't be happening," I murmured, but my hands had already found their way to his shoulders, feeling the fine texture of his suit's fabric. He didn't reply, but the smile I felt against my skin said everything. The heat in the small space now felt like it was on fire, and every touch of his was like fuel, feeding something I could no longer contain. I couldn't tell if the heat was coming from him or from my own body, but I knew there was no turning back. Every inch of the confined space seemed to conspire to pull us closer, and the muffled sound of the rain outside faded as my senses focused on one thing: him. "You're taking my breath away," I murmured, trying to regain control. He smiled a slow, provocative smile, and I could feel the tension in the air intensify like a cord stretched to its limit. "It's not air you're lacking," he replied, his voice low and rough, as if daring me to deny it. Before I could find the words, he leaned in closer until there was no space left between us. The cold elevator wall against my back contrasted with the heat of his body so close to mine. The sensation completely threw me off balance, and my hands instinctively gripped his shoulders, searching for some kind of stability. "This is madness," I murmured, but my voice was a weak whisper, barely audible. "It is," he agreed, his fingers tracing a delicate line along my side. "But you don't seem to want it to stop." His hands found my waist again, firm and certain, as if they knew exactly where they were meant to be. When the fabric of my dress lifted slightly under his touch, a shiver ran down my spine. It was as if every movement of his was calculated, designed to make me lose whatever shred of control I had left. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that I should stop, that this was wrong. But every part of me begged for the opposite. His scent, woody and intoxicating, seemed to blend with the heat of our bodies. Then, as if all barriers had been shattered, I felt his lips graze the curve of my neck. Light at first, almost hesitant, before growing firmer with an intensity that made my heart race. "You know you shouldn't be doing this," I managed to say, though my voice was shaky and faint. "And no," he answered without hesitation. But the way he continued to hold me made it clear that stopping wasn't an option. As his lips traveled up my neck to my jawline, it felt as if the tension in my body would explode. My hands, which had been on his shoulders, slid to the collar of his shirt, my fingers gripping the fabric as if pulling him even closer. He didn't resist. Instead, he leaned in further, his body firm against mine. His fingers found the hem of my dress, sliding upward slowly until stopping at my thigh. The touch was both bold and controlled, as if he knew exactly what he was doing to me. My entire body felt hot, every movement sending waves of heat that quickened my breath. "You should tell me to stop," he whispered, so close that the sound felt like a touch. "Maybe I should," I replied, but my hands clung tighter to his arms, betraying the words I could barely form. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There was something in his gaze that was more than just desire, it was intensity, as if he were daring me to surrender completely. And I did. With a swift movement, he lifted me by the waist, my back pressing against the elevator wall. My dress rose higher, and the air around us felt even thicker. Before I realized it, I was completely enveloped, my legs wrapped around him, while his hands held me firmly. The grip was so tight it felt impossible to escape, but I knew that even if I could, I wouldn't. The heat of the moment made my mind spin. Every touch, every shared breath was like a wildfire spreading. I couldn't tell where my body ended and his began. Everything felt like one. The cold elevator wall served as an almost ironic contrast to the heat radiating between us. My hands found their way to his hair, my fingers tangling in the strands as our lips finally met. It was intense and hurried, yet charged with a desire that seemed to grow with every second. Every move he made was deliberate, yet filled with a restrained urgency, as if he were holding back at the very last moment. When the sound of the elevator finally buzzed, signaling it was working again, reality pulled us back. He gently set me down, and I quickly adjusted my dress, my face burning as the air around us remained heavy with everything that had just happened. The elevator arrived at the ground floor, and he stepped out first, pausing for a moment before turning back to me. "Until next time," he said, with a smile that seemed to know far more than I wanted to admit. And then he was gone, leaving me standing there, my legs still trembling and my heart racing. As I walked out of the building, I realized I had never asked his name, but deep down I knew I'd never forget that face.